In a world without gunpowder, engines, or modern communication, medieval armies managed to carve out vast empires using only discipline, strategy, and the tools available to them. Castles rose as symbols of control, knights charged into battle clad in steel, and peasants transformed into soldiers through feudal duty. Warfare was not just about brute strength. It was about organization, clever use of terrain, and the ability to sustain campaigns across months and even years. This is the story of how medieval armies, relying on loyalty, faith, and ingenuity, built powerful states and reshaped history without the technologies we take for granted today. Number 1. Origins of medieval power. Feudal power took shape where imperial administration had thinned, and local defense became a daily problem. Authority grew from land, oath, and the ability to mobilize armed men when harvests and weather allowed. A ruler's first asset was not a treasury or an arsenal, but a web of obligations. Lords bound by oath, vassals holding land in return for mounted service, and villagers expected to muster with spear or bow when summoned. This exchange protection for service sat on top of the manorial economy, where surplus grain, grazing rights, and forge work fed the horse, the soldier, and the farrier, who kept both in fighting condition. Mounted shock cavalry, enabled by the stirrup and a culture of horsemanship, became the prestige arm, but prestige did not equal autonomy. It depended on steady support from estates, monasteries, and towns that produced fodder, shoes, mail, and later plate. Power clustered around households rather than ministries. A king's or duke's hall gathered household knights, squires, clerks, and armourers into a standing corps that could march quickly, stiffen a levy, or escort a tax convoy. That household corps gave rulers continuity between seasons and campaigns, while the wider feudal levy expanded numbers when campaigning weather turned favourable. Legal instruments turned muscle into structure. The right to ban men to arms, the counting of knight fees, and later cash commutations like scutage allowed rulers to translate landholding into predictable force or revenue. Coin was never irrelevant. Cash hired specialists, crossbowmen, engineers, guides, and bought provisions when foraging would alienate allies. Castles did not just defend, they mapped authority onto terrain. A chain of fortifications along borders and river crossings created corridors for taxation, safe movement, and wintering troops. Marcher lordships on frontiers, whether along the Elbe in Wales or on the Ebro combined military entrepreneurship with delegated sovereignty, letting ambitious nobles push the frontier while nominally serving the crown. Cities and the church added layers rather than alternatives. Bishops commanded estates and sometimes fielded contingents. Abbeys provisioned armies and minted coin. Urban militias protected gates and markets, while communal loans and tolls financed sieges and bridges. Ideology supplied glue, sacral kingship, and later, penitential warfare framed service as lawful and meritorious, turning musters into moments of public legitimacy. Seasonal realities, sowing, harvest, muddy roads, set the calendar, so planning meant aligning oaths, supplies, and castle storage with the agricultural year. Out of these constraints emerged a repeatable recipe. Concentrate household professionals, levy vassals by clear quotas, secure corridors with castles, supplement with paid specialists, and turn land, oath, and faith into organized violence that could hold ground after the banners came down. Number 2. Weapons and armor without modern tech. The foundation of medieval military power rested on weapons and protective gear that were simple by modern standards, but refined through centuries of craftsmanship and battlefield adaptation. The sword held symbolic value as the weapon of knights and leaders, but in reality, it was not the most common tool of war. Spears dominated the battlefield because they were inexpensive, easy to produce, and deadly both in formation and individual combat. A spear line could stop a cavalry charge when men stood firm, and its length gave even poorly armored infantry a chance against mounted knights. Alongside the spear, polearms evolved. Halberds, glaives, and bills combined reach with cutting edges, giving infantry the versatility to fight cavalry and other foot soldiers alike. Bows and later crossbows were equally important. The longbow, perfected in England, required years of training to master, but could pierce mail and even some plate at long range, creating devastating volleys before melee began. Crossbows, though slower to reload, demanded less training and delivered immense penetrating power, making them valuable in sieges where defenders could hold walls with precision fire. Siege engines magnified this principle. Catapults, mangonels, and trebuchets hurled stones, incendiaries, and diseased carcasses over walls, achieving destructive results without gunpowder. Each of these technologies was based on mechanics, counterweights, and torsion rather than explosives, proving how pre-modern science could still dominate the battlefield. Armor developed in response to these threats. Early reliance on chainmail provided flexibility and decent protection. But as crossbows and heavy swords became widespread, plate elements were added. By the 14th century, full suits of plate armor appeared, crafted to deflect arrows and absorb strikes. Contrary to popular myth, these suits were not impossibly heavy. They allowed knights to mount horses, fight, and even run short distances, though heat and fatigue remained constant challenges. Helmets evolved from simple nasal helms to visored great helms and later bassinets, offering greater visibility and breathing room while still deflecting blows. Shields, too, adapted in shape and size depending on whether they were used in formation, on horseback, or during sieges. Without modern firearms, effectiveness depended on the balance between offense and defense. Weapon makers pushed designs to counter new armor, while armorers responded with stronger alloys and better joint protection. This arms race shaped the appearance of medieval soldiers and defined the rhythm of warfare. Weapons were not just tools. They were reflections of regional resources and traditions. Scandinavian warriors favored axes, Italian militias specialized in crossbows, and English armies relied on longbowmen. These variations showed how geography, economy, and local skills influenced the tools of war. The entire system proved that even without modern technology, disciplined use of crafted steel, wood, and leather could secure victories and expand empires. Number 3. Strategies and tactics. Medieval armies built power not only through weapons and manpower, but also by adapting strategies to the realities of a world without advanced technology. The most basic yet effective method was the shield wall, a formation in which infantry locked shields tightly together, creating a barrier of wood and iron that could withstand cavalry charges and repel waves of attackers. This tactic, inherited from earlier Germanic and Viking traditions, required discipline more than equipment, and its success depended on cohesion rather than individual skill. Cavalry charges represented another cornerstone of medieval battle tactics. Knights, heavily armored and mounted on destriers, delivered shock power designed to break enemy lines. Yet this tactic only succeeded if infantry had already softened the opposition, or if terrain favored the horsemen. When terrain was muddy, forested, or broken, cavalry lost its advantage, which is why commanders carefully chose battlefields that maximized their strengths. Terrain and positioning were themselves decisive tools. Hills gave archers the chance to fire down at advancing enemies, rivers restricted flanking maneuvers, and forests provided cover for ambushes. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 both highlight how strategic use of ground could allow a smaller force to overcome a larger one. At Agincourt, muddy fields funneled French knights into narrow spaces, where English longbowmen inflicted massive casualties. Here, tactics overcame numerical superiority, showing that medieval warfare was as much about planning as brute strength. Siege tactics became increasingly central, since castles controlled territory more effectively than open field battles. Armies surrounded fortresses, cut supply lines, and applied pressure until defenders surrendered. Siege engines like trebuchets, rams, and towers provided mechanical solutions to walls too strong to breach with manpower alone. Starvation was often as decisive as combat, because long blockades could force capitulation without large-scale bloodshed. The ability to conduct extended sieges reflected organizational strength, as armies needed steady supplies and discipline to remain in the field for months. Flexibility mattered just as much as established strategies. Commanders combined arms by mixing infantry, cavalry, and archers, creating synergy where each group covered the weaknesses of the others. Infantry held formations, cavalry struck weak points, and missile troops weakened enemies before close contact. Diplomacy and deception also played roles. Alliances, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare often determined outcomes. Mongol tactics in Eastern Europe, for example, used rapid cavalry maneuvers and false withdrawals to lure enemies into traps. In Western Europe, the use of banners, drums, and horns allowed commanders to coordinate across chaotic battlefields. What defined medieval strategy was the balance between resource limits and creative adaptation. Without gunpowder, victories depended on disciplined